currently contracted volumes going into Japan by 2020 will need to be recontracted. So we're not even talking about a growth market. We're actually talking about a market that over the long term will get smaller. But even within that market, there's a lot of churn in the existing contract structure. And so there is opportunity, at some point in time to say, well, let's not just simply roll over a contract. What we need to do is continue to stimulate new supply coming into the market. The market is vibrant when new supply is continually coming into the market at an appropriate cost structure. The market gets distorted when you've seen what's happened in the last few years, where we've had major disruptions occur in the marketplace. And you can argue Fukushima may have been one of those, but there were disruptors before that in the market that got sellers too used to a very close linkage with oil supply or oil price. And that was just simply that demand had outgrown supply over a long period of time, and the only new demand coming into the market was effectively controlled supply coming out of one major supplier. A disruption occurs, one that none of us could see at the time. It takes a huge amount of energy out of a particular marketplace. That marketplace then needs to take in energy at the same time it's trying to get its fiscal position in place. It's devaluing its currency, which means its cost of energy is going higher. It goes and does what it's always done. It creates new supply in the marketplace. And so it's underpinned those volumes coming out of the US. And so it's brought new supply into the market. And what we need to do is think of a way that we stop trying to control when supply comes in and let market forces determine when supply comes in. Because we know typically if we try and control it, then we get caught up in policy issues and so forth. And the problem then is you've got one hand on the accelerator, one hand on the brake, and you're always going like this. And it's really, really difficult for industry to know over long term what sort of return they're going to get for the money that they invest. Very considerable money, particularly for those of us who still explore.
Okay. As promised, we will go to Pigeonhole. And let me just pick up the question that appears to be the most popular. And after this question, maybe we can take a question from the floor. If you want to ask a question, you can just raise your hand. A mic will be passed to you. But let's just take this question from the floor. How can gas compete against cheap coal? Do you think carbon pricing is needed? Sharif, what do you think?
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
I think you don't need to elaborate. Go to Beijing. You have choices to make. Pollution is real. Environmental issues are real. You have to decide what kind of quality of life you want for yourself and what quality of life you want for your children. And if you make the right choices, you have to put a cost on environmental issues. If you don't put a social cost on hydrocarbons in general, you're not reflecting the real cost of exploration and production and consumption.
Okay.
So I think it's absolutely essential that a carbon pricing mechanism be put in place if you want to be able to survive, and that's on a global basis.
Peter, what do you think?
Look, I think a carbon pricing mechanism is going to be important in the long term. What we're really talking about here, though, is as developing nations within Asia start to focus, move away from focusing on the sustainability of their citizens to one where things like quality of life become more and more important, and those citizens demand a quality of life that they're seeing people in other parts of the world enjoy. And Sharif has mentioned one of those, and of course it's what we call PM 2.5, which is small particulates in the air. Beijing is known well for it, but a number of cities in China, particularly as you move towards the west, suffer from similar challenges as we move forward. And there's a number of cities in Asia, and of course, we're in Singapore. I'd pose the question, how much would Singapore be willing to pay to have clean air? And if you're looking at it today and the challenges that your neighbours are providing with respect to clean air. I think the citizens of Singapore at some point would say that we need to do something about this, and if it's within your control, then you're willing to do those things that are required to do that. And for China, most of it is within their control, because most of the particulates issues they're dealing with. This is not even a carbon issue, okay? The carbon debate is for the Western world, the developed world. All right? That's a top of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs debate. When you're in the developing world, you know, what sea levels are going to be in 50 years is not front of mind. What is front of mind is pollution. It's air pollution. It's the quality of life that we are living today. And there are things that in the developed world we've taken for granted because we were able to deal with those things 30 and 40 years ago. Asia, in many nations in Asia, are still dealing with these challenges as they're trying to move their economies forward. So, in my view, carbon pricing will be important. There'll be an important debate that will occur in Paris later this year. But my view is local citizens will start to demand this. You've seen this in other places, like the US, for example. And I think you'll start to see local legislators take action. You've seen that occur in Japan, with particularly around the nuclear industry. You'll see more of an evolution towards super cities, particularly in China. And those super cities will have the power to exercise their own regulations over the types of energy that they want to be used within the boundaries of those cities. So I think you're going to see that sort of an evolution. That'll probably go faster than state-mandated changes. I think you'll find the citizens will demand it.
So that unfortunately, PM 2.5 is something that Singaporeans currently are very familiar with and monitoring quite often. And I think there's a common thread between what Sharif and Peter shared regarding the relative competitiveness of coal to gas, and what I'm hearing is the social cost, that as it is not necessarily mandated, but as people look at the effects of what it's costing them in terms of air pollution, that may drive
I'd be careful. I'm not in any way mandating that coal doesn't have a place in the energy mix. It does. It really does, because it does create local employment as well, and we can't move away from that. It has a low cost base. I think, though, we need to demand the same standards, though, with respect to emissions. And my point is it's more than simply a carbon discussion. There's other elements to this. And as we're building or putting in new plants, whether it be gas-fired, whether it be nuclear, whether it be coal, we need to have a common set of standards globally with respect to the installation and what we're looking for out of that. And because otherwise we can get into this carbon debate, and I worry sometimes that you say, well, let's set a carbon price. Well, how do I read that? Is that a license to pollute? Does that mean if I can afford it and I can afford to pay for carbon, you've now given me a license to pollute? Because I can look at it that way, and that troubles me, to be quite honest. There's a principal issue in there somewhere that I really haven't been able to come to grips with in that particular debate. Does it make us more efficient? Maybe it does, but I'll tell you that efficiency will be competed out over time, and then we'll get margin back into the business. So where does carbon price go then, when we become very efficient in our industries? So I'm not sure. It's one of those ones, I'm not sure whether it's just a convenient tax, another way of taxing. I'm not sure it's going to solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Is there a question from the floor? There's a gentleman over there, if we could get a mic to him.
Name is Anant. I've been in the oil fields and trading gas on TTF and BP Germany corridor once. So a question for Sharif is, when you start actually pushing LNG into Europe, and it comes on top of the Russian long-term contracts of flowing gas, how much will you depress the gas prices there? And then for both of you, the question is that today we have two huge players, and with Iran and Qatar and Russia, will we soon see a gas OPEC that was perhaps thought of a few years ago? How far away is that?
Well, we haven't been invited to gas OPEC, so I, I don't know. You have to keep things in perspective. A little bit of gas from the United States will go to Europe, but Russian gas will still be the dominant player and will control a third of the market. So I don't think will impact prices, will impact choices and liquidity. And it's a very attractive market for us, and we think it's going to continue to develop if prices remain reasonable. But I see us more as price takers than price makers in the European market. I think given the number of players that are coming between Australia and the United States, it's not just one company or one national oil company that controls the production. It's a lot of different players. By the time you're finished with the current wave of Australian and American projects, you're going to have 30, 40 players sending different volumes in different places. You're going to have 10 to 12 cargoes every day that you can bid on. And I think it's going to be very hard for anybody to control anything on a long-term basis. So you will have a true market mechanism that reflects a message from consumers to suppliers in terms of whether they need more or not. And that's what will justify the pricing.
Well, let me talk about Russian gas, maybe, if I can for a moment. It really comes down to energy mix and energy security, and what you decide as a nation is really the best range for you on energy security. You know, pipeline gas is great because once you turn it on, it has a low cost of supply generally. The reality, though, is pipeline gas sometimes becomes disrupted. So the real advantage with LNG at the moment, it is a very flexible market and becoming more flexible. And you have optionality both in source and destination. As you know, pipeline gas is generally fixed at one point to another, and it often travels across neighbourhoods that aren't always in the best shape for one reason or another. And nations will take a view themselves on how much they want to rely on energy coming from one particular source. And so that's my push, is to really think about energy security, energy sustainability, high integrity industries and so forth as being ones that really do have reliable energy sources. And I mentioned early on, that doesn't mean one type of energy coming from different places. It means multiple energy sources that need to coexist together. You know, Russian gas will flow. And so the implications of less Russian gas in Europe are very simple. We're going to see more of it in Asia. And so it will flow. It's one of those givens in life. And the other given in life is never underestimate the ability of industry to do something that you could never dream of. And so what is conventional logic often, either in an investment space or a development space, is often blown apart. But it's blown apart by people who may have different choices, they may have different objectives in mind, and they'll completely disrupt your view of what you think the world should look like into the future. So my view is once you have a resource, it will flow, it will move to market, it will move to the best market, and those markets are becoming more and more fungible over time. That just means we need to develop cost of supply that can compete with that, and compete with that consistently over time. You can't deny it, you have to deal with it, and you have to ensure that you present yourself in the very best way for people to make choices.
Okay. There's a question from the floor on Pigeonhole to Woodside. Can you comment on the rising costs of gas projects in Australia? I suppose comment to the extent of where it's going and how it's going to be sustainable.
Yeah, well, look, what you see in Australia today is really based on decisions that were made 5, 6, 7 years ago. So you've seen projects now get into the last 10% of their development timeline. You know, the rising costs in Australia, let me say this is a misnomer, and we need to be really careful about it because, you know, wages in Australia have certainly risen, And as Australians, we should be proud that we're able to provide our citizens with good wages and working conditions. The reality is, though, some of the costs that you see are driven off work schedules that not many of us could work for very long, given the hours away that people are working. They're driven off very remote operations, and so we often use that as an excuse. The reality is about 40% of our costs in Australia are back office costs. And so as we look at it now, there's been a rise in back office costs. It's a compliance issue. It's an issue in the way that we're going about our engineering. Engineering used to be a very small percentage of a project's cost. Now it's driven up to 25 to 30% of a project's cost. So we've allowed these back office costs to get out of control. Equally, on the development itself, a number in the room will know, but the reality is we haven't been building these projects in Australia. We've actually been building them in yards in Asia. The reality is Asia's becoming uncompetitive. And the delay in the projects has been the delay in the delivery of modules out of yards in Asia. Now, sure, when they get to Australia, there's a cost associated with that, but that kind of wraps up into this issue around, well, Australia is expensive. No, I'd say we've got a collective challenge. We've got a challenge that the traditional wage arbitrage that we could rely upon that said we don't need to be as efficient as we should be, that we can bespoke in everything we do, is now gone. Asia demands higher wages. Asia demands a higher standard of living, and we can't just simply move the construction of LNG modules offshore and expect that they'll be delivered either on schedule or on cost. And neither of those has been occurring. There's some pretty standout examples at the moment. So I think collectively we've got a challenge here. Where does that mean? I think also as an industry, and Australia has suffered from this, is there's two things we've done when price is high. When price is high and margin is good, we forgot how we get there. And we forgot how we get there, and we start to do things because we can, not because we should. And the first thing we stop doing when margin comes back into the business is we stop sharing, we stop collaborating, we stop having infrastructure that is multi-use and so forth. So we become inefficient in the deployment and use of our capital, not because we should, but because we can. The second thing we do is we convince ourselves that bigger is better. And so you get efficiencies through bigger, bigger, bigger. The reality is bigger equals complexity. And in my view, the industry has become too complex. It's become too complex in its outsourcing, and it's become too complex in its logistics requirements. If I can deliver a site, put a fence around it, a tier one contractor will build whatever I need on cost and on schedule. The reality is the major cost overruns we're seeing in our projects are driven around logistics, they're being driven around site preparation and so forth. It's not the actual construction of the LNG plant is the issue. And so as we move forward, industry needs to actually take a leaf out of Sharif's book and actually start to think about a different business model that is far more efficient in its capital deployment and that is far more efficient in linking the revenue stream to the cost stream and sharing that risk across it. And so we've got a lot to learn from the US, I believe, in the general industry. And I don't think, my view is those learnings haven't all got through yet. And it's going to take another couple of years.
Thank you.
Be happy to come visit if you want.
You're welcome to come and join us anytime.
I would take another question from the floor, if there is one. Anyone wants to ask any of these gentlemen a question? If you could just raise your hand. I don't see any. We'll just go back to Pigeonhole then. Am I missing anyone out? No. Okay. Sharif, maybe we could ask you, on one of the questions here, global gas market dynamics. Do you see Asian gas prices prevailing in view of current market conditions and pricing dynamics, given where China is, etc.? I think what people are asking is this probably near the floor? And with the context that much of Asian prices are actually linked to oil.
I think for the time being, there's enough gas to be supplied at current prices, so there's no particular rush. I think with current prices where they are, it would be very difficult to sanction new projects almost anywhere, including the United States. But we're not very far. I think it wouldn't take much of a move, maybe 20–25% from where it is today, to start justifying additional projects in the United States. The problem is to get that signal for a sustainable period of time. 5 years or so. I don't think you need 20 years anymore, but you need at least 5 years.
Okay.
So the answer is no.
Okay.
I don't think it's sustainable.
I think this is a really important point. If we get too comfortable in today's pricing, it will simply mean investment won't occur. Right? It's far more attractive for companies to do other things with their capital, and they will go into that mode as they look at maximising the returns to their investors, because it's a competitive market. Companies are also competing for capital, investor capital, as we move forward. And so, Sharif's right. In today's price, if you thought today's price was going to be the price for the future, it's very difficult to see how companies can invest, because the cost structure hasn't come down, and it's not clear to me that the cost structure will be able to come down far enough. So I don't know where the new floor is on costs. And we can't just simply assume that simply because oil price went up and it's come down, that costs can do the same thing, because some of those costs, as I mentioned, are labour costs, and those labour costs are very, very difficult to work out of the system. We also need people to have some time to think about new innovative ways of doing things. And it's not just a financing issue, it's going to be around the way we design and construct and execute and so forth, and reducing the timelines from the time we discover to the time that first revenues come through. So all of those things just need time, and industry often needs a couple of years to work through that. I think you're going to see a really big signal over the next 2 to 3 months. And you'll see the big signal. If you thought the reduction in CapEx in 2015 has been dramatic, wait until you see 2016. And the reason I say that is because particularly the larger companies globally had already set budget by the time oil crashed at the end of last year. They set their budget now. And so it was still $85, and there was an expectation that OPEC would hold the floor. They've now got a clear air in front of them, and they're resetting budgets on a completely different basis. And so I think you'll start to see many, many projects start to move out in time. You'll start to see investment in the future get pulled back. Things like exploration, R&D and so forth will get pulled back. And I think you'll see the shipping market in particular is going to be stressed over this next period, as people are unwilling to commit to LNG vessels going forward, because they're just not sure where those volumes will be moved to. So in all of that uncertainty, there's a huge amount of opportunity for those who are brave.
Exactly. And did I hear you just now, Sharif, that you said if it's $8 to $9 per MMBTU in Asia, it would excite new developments in the US?
Well, as long as Henry Hub stays where it is today, which I don't see any reason why it wouldn't.
Right. Okay.
I'd get excited by a slightly higher price. So
You will be excited.
it's greenfield. So if you look at greenfield and what will get greenfield in, you'll need a slightly higher price, but not far off that.
Okay. Obviously, sorry. Was there a question? Yes. Can somebody pass the man a mic?
You can hear me. Okay, that's better. Ray Wills from ABC Carbon and out of Perth. Hello, Peter. I'm a writer with ABC, and think about your comment on investment in infrastructure in 2016. For the last 3 to 4 years, investment in clean tech has been reasonably steady. It even got through the GFC okay, and investing at a rate of $300 billion. If that does hold consistent, and your comment in relation to other infrastructure spend also holds true to be saying that it decreases in 2016, does that actually represent a faster transition to clean tech than we might have imagined?
Look, it's a good question, Ray. I think there's a couple of things here that may or may not change this. Tax structures around the world also drive where investors put their money. So the LNG industry in particular is a very heavy capital investment in the manufacturing facility and the pipelines. North America, the US in particular, has tax structures that allow that to be bifurcated or to be broken up. Whereas tax structures in other jurisdictions encourage you to bring it all together. And so, laying off risk or understanding who's the best investor at any particular point in the value chain is also important for us to continue to move forward. With respect to, the capital investment today, and if it drops off next year, will we see a movement to renewables, or I think what you mentioned is clean technologies? No, I don't think you will initially, because in fact there's a whole bunch of new supply coming into the marketplace. And so the competing signals that the market will receive over the next couple of years will be one of diminishing capital as people are committed to giving returns to their shareholders, and they have to deploy that capital elsewhere. It'll be one of diminishing capital, which would give you one signal, versus a whole bunch of new supply coming into the marketplace, which is currently under construction. And so at the moment we don't have an equilibrium. What we have is some quite different signals in the market. And I think buyers are sitting there saying, I'm not sure which is the right signal, I'm not sure when the right time is to move. And it's particularly difficult because a number of these buyers are regulated. They operate themselves in regulated markets, and so they're not exposed to or not able to move their pricing structures up and down with the cost of their energy supply. And so all of these factors come into play, and I think it'll be, the longer it goes on, yes, I would say your point would be correct, but I wouldn't expect to see a fundamental change in the next couple of years at least.
Okay. Time is almost up, and I will give you two gentlemen a choice of two questions related to infrastructure, or rather supporting infrastructure. There's a question here that says, will the growth of microgrids and clean distributed energy disrupt the gas to power baseload markets? So that's one question. Related to that is my own question. What do you think of, obviously a feature of demand is the receiving infrastructure in Asia. Where would you put that level of development of receiving infrastructure in Asia? You get to pick one. Okay, I'll start with Sharif. So you don't get to pick. Sorry, Peter.
Yeah.
Sharif, which one? The growth of microgrids or receiving infrastructure in Asia? Just one.
I think I'll deal with receiving infrastructure. And I would take the example of Europe. When you build infrastructure in order to facilitate receiving an energy source, like Europe has done by building their pipeline capacity, not perfectly, but making major progress, building some very significant regas facilities, both in Northern Europe and in Southern Europe, particularly in Spain, and having the ability to receive alternative sources of natural gas has contributed to reduce the cost of natural gas in Europe dramatically over the last 2 years.
Right.
So if they did not have that infrastructure built, the good news would not have happened.
Right.
And they would have still been dependent on pipeline gas from one or two sources, and with the sources that are actually in decline, they would not have had the ability to replace them.
So what grade would you give Asia in terms of its the development of its
Well, I think
infrastructure?
in Asia, Japan has already built their infrastructure very significantly, so they're in a very nice position to take advantage of the liquidity. China is making progress, but it's not getting there. Somebody mentioned earlier, I think Peter, the almost schizophrenic attitude in China between who owns the regas facilities on the coastline and who delivers the natural gas to the city gates.
Right.
And that has to be solved in order to be able to take advantage of the supply sources that come.
Okay.
India is starting to build their infrastructure, but they still have a way to go. And then all of the remaining economies in Asia that want to be able to benefit from the increased liquidity in the market need to continue to look at the whole picture and decide what kind of infrastructure is necessary for them to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming.
Okay. Thanks, Sharif. And you get to end off.
Yeah, look, my view is microgrids will be the way of the future. You'll see more and more off-grid application for power generation. But it's suited towards a particular type of consumer, which is more residential. So if you look at the amount of use that residential consumers need, you can see both in the developing world and also the developed world, as new subdivisions get developed, new office towers, that there will be more off-grid application and microgrids. Gas plays a very important role, I believe, as a very complementary fuel to renewables in that space. And so when you look at the storage capabilities these days, where the breakpoints are and so forth, gas already is an energy source that you can turn on and off. I can run a gas-fired power station from my iPhone. I can't do that with other sources of energy, which have a longer startup time and a longer shutdown time. So, for those of you, your water heater at your home is probably already an on-demand water heater. So if you think in that context, you think of battery storage that's available now for small communities, you think of places like India and so forth, where it's very unlikely you're going to have national transportation systems. You can see that occurring more and more over time. The reality, though, large industrial customers still need volumes of energy in quantities that just can't be delivered by off-grid applications. So there's just a huge barrier or break point in that regard. And so I see there'll be actually two markets. We talk a lot about LNG in its liquid form. It's generally good for bulks. I think you'll see a lot more of it going into shipping, particularly we talk about pollution, and the shipping industry has a very large challenge globally around pollution. Those industries will take bulk, but we need to remember compressed natural gas, and most of Asia runs on tuk-tuks already. That's a classic application of it. It's already in the automobile fleet. Yep. It's already providing clean energy. It already has the distribution systems. We just need to unlock our mind and really go for it. And as I said, rather than see this as being a competition between fuel sources, we need to see how we can deliver the most efficient energy solution to consumers, because at the end of the day, when they flick the light switch, they generally don't ask the question as to where this has come from.
Thank you. And with that, we will conclude. Please join me in thanking Sharif and Peter for some very wonderful insights on gas and its transition in the energy space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wee Sing. As in the conference tradition, we'd like to invite you to take a picture together, all three of you up front. Thank you. As we now, ladies and gentlemen, refresh the ballroom for our next panel discussion. We're a little off target. It's scheduled for 2 p.m., just a couple of minutes off target. So sit back right here as we refresh the stage for our next panel discussion, ladies and gentlemen.